The bombs were not the worst sound. Across the Pacific, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, American warships pounded these islands for weeks, and the Japanese soldiers, sealed in the rock below, barely felt it. What broke them came later and quieter. It came in the silence between attacks, from the dark corners, where their own dead were stacked, and one survivor would describe it in words that sound impossible. But before we get to that sound, you have to understand why tens of thousands of men chose to be buried alive in the first place. By 1944, Japan was losing, and its generals changed the way their men were meant to die. For years, they had met American landings at the water's edge and finished with a banzai charge, soldiers running onto machine guns with swords raised. It failed every time. So at Biak, then Peleliu, then Iwo Jima, they went underground instead, trading quick death for a war of attrition built to make every yard cost American blood. Peleliu had already proven the idea worked. The Marines who took it suffered roughly twice the casualties of the beach battles that came before. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kurabayashi banned the banzai charge outright and ordered each of his men to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. He wasn't planning a battle. He was planning a slow, expensive blade, and it worked. Of roughly 21,000 defenders on that island, only 216 were ever taken alive, but a fortress built to trap an enemy seals in the men who dig it, too. Kurabayashi's engineers cut more than 11 miles of tunnels and 5,000 caves into 8 square miles of rock, some chambers large enough for 300 men, entrances bent at 90-degree angles. So grenades and fire couldn't turn the corner, and Iwo Jima is a live volcano. Underground, the heat ran past 120 degrees, and sulfur gas bled through the walls so thickly that the tunnelers had to wear gas masks and could work only 15 minutes at a stretch. That was the air they lived in. Then the Americans came and brought a method with a name: blowtorch and corkscrew. Flame to empty a cave, explosives to seal it shut. From inside the rock, all of this arrived as a sequence of sounds. First, the scrape of drilling overhead, as engineers bored down through the ceiling to drop charges. Then the roar of the flamethrower. A Marine on Okinawa explained what fire did in a closed space. It sucks out all the oxygen. Men were found deep in the caves without a mark on them, dead where they sat, suffocated. When flame wasn't enough, the engineers simply closed the door. Charges and armored dozers sealing the entrances until the cave became a tomb, with whoever was still breathing inside. At Biak, after gasoline was poured into a cave mouth and lit, the soldiers outside heard a run of muffled thuds roll up through the ground. The ammunition stores inside cooking off. One private went in afterward to look and came out vomiting. "It looks like a scene from hell," he said. Almost none of them came out alive, and part of the reason is written into the architecture itself. Loudspeaker teams, many of them Nisei, Japanese Americans whose own families sat in US internment camps, crawled up to the cave mouths and broadcast surrender terms in Japanese. It mostly failed. A captured prisoner explained why. The tunnels were angled, so the sound couldn't bend around the corners. So only the men nearest the entrance ever heard the offer. Everyone else heard rock. And those who did hear, it had been told the Americans would rape and torture anyone who gave up. So they stayed and died. On Peleliu, of about 11,000 defenders, fewer than 24 were taken alive. For the wounded, the fighting was almost the quiet part. On Okinawa, the army pulled schoolgirls into its cave hospitals, the Haimuri students, some only 15, to hold the lamps, often the only light in the tunnels, during amputations done with barely any ether, and to carry out the severed limbs and the dead. Tsuniko Shiroma was one of them. Years later, she described the sound that found her once the shelling stopped and the cave went still. At night, in the quiet, I could actually hear the maggots wriggling out of the bodies. The corpses themselves, she said, gave off a low sound, like something cooking slowly over a flame. That was what the bombardment had been covering all along, not the guns, the silence after them. The hospital caves at least had a purpose. The worst of Okinawa happened in the caves that held no soldiers at all. The natural limestone hollows the islanders call Gama, where whole families climbed underground to wait out the shelling, and then discovered they could not come back up. By the time the Americans landed on April 1, 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army had spent months telling Okinawan civilians one thing over and over. The enemy did not take prisoners. Men would be crushed under tank treads. Women would be raped and then killed. In villages where troops were stationed, soldiers handed out grenades to civilians for exactly this purpose. Something to throw at the Americans and something to keep. Surrender was treason. Anyone who actually tried to give themselves up could be shot by their own side. And the army's own guidelines held that officials and civilians were to live and die together. A person sealed in the dark with that arithmetic had almost nowhere left to stand. At Chibikarigama, in the village of Yamaton, roughly 140 people were hiding in a cave, about 100 feet deep, when American soldiers reached the mouth of it on the morning of April 2. The soldiers called in Japanese for the people to come out. They dropped leaflets promising no one would be harmed. The people did not believe them. 2 boys ran at the entrance with sharpened bamboo spears, the only weapons they had, and were shot. And then deep in the cave, in the dark, the killing turned inward. A survivor recalled an 18-year-old girl calling out to her mother in the black. "Mommy, kill me," she said, "better that than the Americans." The mother killed her daughter, and that first death set the rest in motion. Parents killed their children with kitchen knives, with sickles, with the flaming oil poured out of their own lamps, and then killed themselves. When it was over, 83 people were dead, and 47 of them were children. The youngest was 2 years old. Survivors who lived through it would describe the sequence the same way the men in the tunnels did. A wave of frantic noise, screaming and pleading and struggle, and then quite suddenly, a settling quiet. What made the quiet so complete was isolation. The people inside believed they were the last ones left alive on the island, that the cave was the whole world, and the world outside it belonged to the enemy. The village record would later note that the people in Chibikarigama had been cut off from the outside, gripped by the sense that they were the only ones still alive. With no other voice reaching them, the only instructions they had were the ones they had carried down into the dark. Chibikari was not an isolated horror. On the small islands of the Kurama group, just west of the main island, the same thing had already happened days earlier, before the main invasion even began. On Takashiki, a 16-year-old boy named Nobuaki Kinjo, driven, he later said, into a kind of insanity by the soldiers' propaganda, killed his own mother and 2 younger siblings in a mass suicide on the day the Americans came ashore. He carried it for the rest of his life. Across the southern islands, the pattern held with grim consistency. The deaths clustered in the places where the army was and thinned out where it wasn't. The Americans tried, in their way, to reach the civilians too. The same loudspeaker and leaflet teams that had crawled up to the military caves called into the Gama as well, promising food and water and safety to anyone who came out. But the fear the army had planted ran deeper than any promise broadcast from outside, and the architecture defeated the message here just as it had underground. A voice at the mouth of a cave does not travel far into 100 feet of stone, and the people furthest in, the ones with the smallest children, pressed deepest into the dark, heard the least of it. What they heard instead was one another, and the soldiers among them. The schoolgirls the army had pressed into the hospital caves reached the end no more gently. Of the more than 200 girls of the Haimiri Student Corps mobilized as battlefield nurses, fewer than half survived the battle. In the last days, the army abruptly dissolved their unit and turned them out of the tunnels into the open, into the very shelling the caves had been keeping off them, and many were killed in the hours and days that followed. When they had first been mobilized, they had been told they would be back at their school desks within a week. Instead, by the time the battle ended on June 22, it had killed more than 188,000 people, a great many of them Okinawan civilians, a share of the island's own population that Okinawa has never fully stopped grieving. Because the deaths in the Gama were not madness, and they were not, in the simplest sense, choice. They were obedience, the same instruction the garrison had been given, arriving as sound in a place where no other sound could reach. Passed to people who had never held a rifle, die first. Where there were soldiers in the cave, there were grenades and there was certainty. In caves without them, families more often crept out toward the leaflets and lived. The mass deaths occurred, overwhelmingly, in the villages where Japanese troops were present. The difference between coming up into the light and dying in the dark was, in many cases, simply which voice a person could hear and whether anyone in the dark could talk them out of it. Sometimes someone did. In one cave, a young woman named Kamieta reached into her medical kit for the grenade she had been saving to kill herself with and found it gone. Her father had taken it out and thrown it away, and when she screamed at him, all he would say was that life is a treasure, nache du takara, in the old Okinawan phrase. By throwing away her grenade, he saved her life. That was the whole battle in miniature. Two voices in the dark, one telling you to die, one telling you to live, and no way to know which one the future would prove right. For the youngest, there was no such argument, and for the men who had issued the orders that filled those caves, the arguing was over too. They were, by then, underground themselves and running out of time. The last transmissions. On Iwo Jima, the end had a shape you could hear coming. By the middle of March 1945, the fighting had narrowed to a single fortified ravine in the island's north that the Marines called the Gorge. Kurabayashi had pulled the remnants of his garrison into it, and the Americans reduced it the way they had reduced everything else, drilling down through the rock to drop charges, burning through the passages at a rate of about 10 meters an hour, and pouring phosphorus into holes bored in the ceiling when flame alone could not reach the men below. From inside, the war was again a sequence of sounds arriving through stone. The scrape overhead, the roar, the pressure change as the air went bad. One account preserved from those weeks records the method being described. From the American side, in a phrase that treated the men underground as vermin. This was, one message said, like killing cockroaches. This was the trap Kurabayashi had built, closing on the man who built it. He had held the island for 36 days against an enemy who expected to take it in 5, and he had done it by refusing the Banzai charge and forcing the Americans to dig his men out one sealed chamber at a time. It worked so well that Iwo Jima became the only major battle in the Pacific where American casualties outnumbered Japanese ones. But the price of a fortress that expensive to take was that almost no one who defended it walked out. Every man in that garrison had gone into the battle carrying the same instructions. Before the landings, Kurabayashi had written and circulated 6 courageous battle vows, ordering each of his soldiers to kill 10 Americans before dying and to fight on from the tunnels to the last. The Marines gave the worst of that ground a name of their own. The tangle of ridges, caves, and hidden guns in the island's center. Anchored on a rise the maps called Hill 382, and a knob of rock the Marines called Turkey Knob, with the open killing ground between them, became known simply as the meat grinder. It ground for weeks, and it ate men from both sides in numbers that still stagger the accounting. The Americans had wanted the island badly enough to pay that price. Its airfield sat roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, and once they were in American hands. Crippled B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan used Iwo Jima's runways for more than 2,000 emergency landings before the war ended. Thousands of airmen who lived because the island had been taken. That was the ledger Kurabayashi's defense was written into. He knew the whole time how it would end for him. Throughout the siege, he wrote letters home, saying his goodbyes without bitterness. And in one of the last of them to his wife, he apologized for never getting around to repairing the kitchen floor, and left instructions for his son to finish the job. One of his ground crew officers, evacuated from the island weeks before the landings, carried a different kind of memory out with him, not an image, but a sound. As his unit assembled to leave, the general passed by and stopped to thank them. The officer never spoke to him directly, only overheard him. And decades later, he still described it in terms of what he had heard. His gentle voice still remains in my heart. He was one of the very few who got to keep anything. Almost everyone who stayed did not survive to remember. On March 17, Kurabayashi radioed his farewell to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, sending along 3 death poems in the old waka form. The historian Kumiko Kakashi, who studied his letters, read those poems not as a soldier's boast, but as a quiet protest against the commanders who had sent his men out to die so cheaply. Then, on the evening of March 23, he sent one last message across the water to the radio station on Chichijima. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. The major on the receiving end kept calling back into the frequency for 3 more days. Nothing ever answered. Kurabayashi is believed to have died in a final assault. His body was never identified, and afterward an American general is said to have spent a whole day searching the beach for it, to bury him with honors, and never found him. The island was declared secure on March 26, but the silence Kurabayashi left behind was not total, and it did not end when the flags went up. A handful of men stayed in the tunnels, coming out at night to steal food and slipping back into the rock before dawn. The last two of them, Yamaguchi Kyufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, did not surrender until January 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle was over. For 4 years, in other words, there were men still living inside a place the maps had already marked as taken. On Okinawa, the same story played out under a different hill. In the southern peninsula of Aroku, Rear Admiral Minoru Oda commanded the Japanese Navy's forces from an underground headquarters his men had dug by hand, a warren of roughly 450 meters of tunnel beneath the ridge. He had come to Okinawa with a nominal force of 10,000, but half were civilian laborers with minimal training, and the rest were ship's gunners with little experience fighting on land. Worse, a miscommunicated order had them destroy their own heavy weapons and withdraw. And when they returned to their positions, they had almost nothing left to fight with. Half the men had no rifle at all. By early June, the U.S. 6th Marine Division had them encircled, and the Americans went to work on the tunnels the way they had on Iwo Jima, drilling from above and injecting gas and explosives near the entrances. Before the end, Oda sent one last telegram out of the hill. It was not about the battle. It was about the Okinawan civilians, the people who had carried ammunition, nursed the wounded, given up everything they owned, and in many cases, their lives. Oda wanted the record to show what they had done. "This is how the Okinawa Prefecture people have fought the war," he wrote, and asked headquarters to give them special consideration in the years to come. Then the transmissions stopped. Oda and roughly 4,000 of his men died in the headquarters, some by their own hand in the command room, some in a last charge out of the entrances, some caught by the gas and explosives fed into the tunnel mouths. The Marines chose to seal the entrances rather than go in after them. When the headquarters was reopened in the 1950s, the remains of more than 2,000 sailors were still inside. The blast scars from a grenade are still on the walls, and Oda's farewell poem, scratched into the stone, is still legible today. 2 hills, 2 islands, the same ending. A voice on a wire, and then a door closing on the men who had spoken. But not everyone got the word that the doors were closing. Some men never heard that the war had ended at all, and a few of them kept fighting it for another 30 years. The men WHO never heard. When Japan surrendered in September 1945, the news did not reach everyone. Scattered across the Pacific were the holdouts, individuals and small groups who did not believe or would not accept that the war was over. By the end of the fighting, there were around 130 of them still hiding out, continuing a war that no longer existed. Over the next 3 decades, most surrendered or died. A few stayed hidden so long that they walked out of the jungle into a world that had forgotten they were ever there. Shoichi Yakai was a tailor before he was a soldier. When American forces retook Guam in 1944, he fled into the island's interior with 9 other men and, when the group scattered, dug himself an underground shelter using a fragment of an artillery shell as his tool. He lived in it for years, hiding by day in a cramped, smoky tunnel of his own making, foraging at night for coconuts, cane toads, snails, rats, whatever the jungle would give him. When a typhoon devastated the island's food supply in the early 1960s, survival got harder still. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, he found leaflets announcing that it was over and dismissed them as an enemy trick. He had been taught, like every soldier of his generation, that being captured alive was a disgrace to be preferred only to death, and he believed it long after there was anyone left to enforce it. Around 1964, he found the bodies of his last 2 companions, dead side by side in their cave. From then on, he was alone. He stayed hidden for another 8 years. On January 24, 1972, 2 local fishermen checking shrimp traps along the Talifofo River stumbled onto him, a hunched, half-starved man in filthy homemade clothes who tried to grab one of their rifles before they overpowered him and carried him out. He had been in the jungle almost 28 years. He had missed the atomic bombs, the surrender, the entire post-war world. He had never seen a television or heard of a jet aircraft. When he returned to Japan, to a crowd of thousands, the first thing he said was an apology. "It is with much embarrassment that I return." The line became a national saying. Japan itself was divided over what he meant. Some saw a victim of the fearsome pre-war schooling that had made war seem noble. Others branded him a simple deserter, and one man mailed him a razor blade with the suggestion he use it. He entered an arranged marriage that November and, improbably, honeymooned on Guam. But Yak never fully escaped the jungle in his own mind. Until his death in 1997, he was haunted by nightmares of being chased by enemy soldiers. And doctors linked the Parkinson's-like illness that killed him to the decades he had spent in hiding. The other famous holdout was different, because for him, the war really was still a war. Hiroo Onoda was an intelligence officer, trained at the Imperial Army's Nakano School to operate alone, indefinitely, and to distrust anything that told him to stop. Sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines in December 1944, he was ordered to harass the occupiers, hold out until the army came back, and under no circumstances surrender or take his own life. The order came with a promise attached: "We'll come back for you." Onoda took every word of it literally, and it built a trap he could not think his way out of. By the logic of his own training, every leaflet, every letter from home, every dropped family photograph was precisely the kind of trick the enemy would use to make him lower his guard. The evidence that the war was over became, to him, proof that the enemy badly wanted him to believe it. So he kept fighting. He began with 3 companions. One surrendered in 1950, and the other 2 were killed in 1954 and 1972, leaving him alone. And his war was not harmless. Over the years, Onoda and his men raided farms and traded fire with police and villagers. And residents of Lubang later said around 30 of them died over that period. Real people killed by a soldier who did not know, or would not admit, that his orders had expired years before. What finally ended it was not evidence. It was a voice, the specific voice he had been waiting almost 30 years to hear. In February 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki found him in the hills. Suzuki had told friends he was setting out to find, in that order, Lieutenant Onoda, a wild panda, and the abominable snowman. And against all odds, he found the first. But Onoda told him the same thing he had told himself for decades. He would come out only when his commanding officer ordered it. So the Japanese government tracked the man down. Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, by then a middle-aged bookseller, flew to Lubang, stood in the jungle, and read aloud the order formally releasing him from duty. Onoda, 52 years old, and nearly 30 years into a war that had ended in 1945, wept, and handed over his sword to the President of the Philippines, who pardoned him. Many on Lubang never forgave him. He was not even the last. Later that same year, an ethnic Taiwanese soldier named Teruo Nakamura was found farming alone on an Indonesian island. 29 years after the war, the last confirmed holdout to come in. And years earlier, a group of roughly 20 holdouts on the tiny island of Anatahan had kept up their own private war into 1951. Onoda himself never really came home. Within a year, he had left Japan for a Japanese farming colony in Brazil, unsettled by a country whose values he no longer recognized, and spent his later years raising cattle and, eventually, running a wilderness school to teach the young the survival skills 3 decades in the jungle had burned into him. The war had trained him too well for him to ever fully put it down. For all of them, the pattern was the same, and it rhymes with the caves of Okinawa. The war did not end when a bomb fell or a broadcast played. It ended, if it ended at all, when a single human voice finally reached them in the dark and told them to stop. Some men waited 3 decades for that voice. Most never got it. And on the islands themselves, tens of thousands of others never came up at all. What's still down there? The United States returned Iwo Jima to Japan in 1968. In 2007, the government restored the island's older name, Iwo 2, correcting a decades-old misreading. Today it is a Japan's self-defense force installation, home to a few hundred personnel, who are its only inhabitants, served by a single working airfield built and rebuilt directly over the old battlefield. From the air, the island looks like almost nothing, a small volcanic wedge in an empty sea. Most of the fortifications have been swallowed by undergrowth, the bunkers cracked open and rusting, the tunnels collapsing, some of them still leaking the rotten egg smell of volcanic gas. It is one of the quietest places you could ever stand. One officer stationed there put it simply, "To me, the whole island is sacred ground." It is also still a grave. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese who died defending the island, about 12,000 have never been recovered and remain officially missing. Sealed in the tunnels the Americans closed, or buried alive by the bombing, or interred by the victors in mass graves marked only on wartime maps. The recovery has always been slow and grim work, complicated by the honeycomb of tunnels, and by the fact that few Japanese soldiers wore any form of identification. Japan has sent search teams to the island nearly every year since the 1950s, and has brought home thousands of sets of remains, but the great majority of the dead are still down there. In 2010, searchers located 2 mass graves, one near the base's runway, one at the foot of Mount Suribachi, with the larger site estimated to hold as many as 2,000 bodies. The planes that fly in and out of Iwo to take off over ground that has never given up its dead. The numbers come home in small increments. In a single-year search, the teams recovered the remains of more than 800 men, handed over to the government at a ceremony before the digging resumed. Those bones were later interred, with tens of thousands of others, at a national cemetery in Tokyo, set aside for the war dead who can no longer be named. When Japan's prime minister flew to the island that same year to pray at the newly found graves, he put it plainly, "I deeply apologize to the war dead for having them wait." He said for having them wait, he meant more than 6 decades to come home. Even the machinery of that final stand has surfaced only slowly. Years later, a radio transmitter, believed to have been used before the garrison's doomed last stand, was discovered on the island. A piece of the very apparatus that had carried Kurabayashi's last words out into the dark. The men who survived spent the rest of their lives trying to finish the recovery. One of them, an army medical officer named Kazuyoshi Morimoto, described the final days in the tunnels. A water ration of half a teacup, urine-soaked bandages tied over their faces. When the Americans fired gas into the caves, mouths too dry and cracked to chew the little bread they had. His makeshift bed, a wooden crate meant for transporting medicine, was still in the tunnel when he returned decades later to search for the bones of the men he had failed to save. "The spirits of our fallen comrades cry out for return to their homeland," he said. He kept going back until he was too old to go, and the searchers themselves have begun to warn that time is running out. The brothers and sisters of the dead are in their 80s and 90s now, and soon there will be no one left who remembers a living face to attach to the bones. The Americans left their own behind, too. Most of the US dead were recovered in 1948, but a couple hundred are still missing from the Iwo Jima campaign, many of them killed in caves or buried by the explosions that sealed those caves shut. Among them is Sergeant William Genost, the Marine combat cameraman who filmed the flag raising on Suribachi in color. 9 days before he was killed, he had been shining a light into a cave to help clear it when he was shot. The cave was taken and its entrance sealed, and his body has never been found. The man who lit the war's most famous image is himself somewhere in the dark, behind a door that was closed almost 80 years ago. Iwo Jima is only one grave among many. Some 88,000 American service members remain listed as missing from the Second World War, and recovery teams still search for them. Across the reefs and jungles and mountain ranges of the Pacific, one set of bones at a time. But few places in the world concentrate the arithmetic so tightly as this one. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, into which almost an entire garrison disappeared, and out of which most of it has never come. The island did not just kill the men who defended it. It kept them, and that is the sound the island keeps, not the bombardment. That ended in 1945. Not the loudspeakers or the flamethrowers or the charges sealing the entrances. What is left on Iwo 2 and under the hill on Okinawa, and in 100 smaller gama across the southern islands, is the thing the guns had been covering all along. The silence that comes after and holds. The nurse on Okinawa said she could hear the maggots. The men in the gorge heard the drilling come down through the ceiling. The families at Chibukarigama heard one voice in the dark and did what it told them. The 2 holdouts on Guam and Lubang heard nothing they would believe, for 28 years and for 30, until a single human voice finally arrived to tell them the war was over. For the 12,000 still inside the rock, no voice ever came, and none is coming now. They are where the doors closed on them, under the runway and the black sand and the quiet. And the quiet is not empty, it never was. That was the whole thing they learned down there, in the last silence, with the shelling finally stopped, and nothing left to cover the sound. The silence